Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we don't just polish up statues of the so-called great men. We pop the hood, get our hands greasy, and find out what really made the engine run. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're pulling into the dusty workshops, the roaring factories, the picket lines, and the vast highways of the man who put America on four wheels. His name? Henry Ford. Some folks say he was the man who invented the American middle class. Some say he was an industrial tyrant, a genius tinkerer who turned farm boys into assembly line cogs. He was called the father of mass production, the champion of the $5 workday, and the publisher of some of the nastiest anti-Semitic screeds the world ever read. The man who made the car cheap enough for the common man to own, but also made damn sure that same man worked like a cog to afford it. So pour yourself something dark and oily, settle in, and ride with me through the dirt roads, factory floors, and contradictions of Henry Ford, the farm boy who hated the plow. To understand Henry Ford, you have to start with dirt under your fingernails and the stubborn ruts of a Michigan farm. Long before the clatter of factory lines or the growl of a Model T engine, there was a restless boy staring across endless fields of stubborn soil, dreaming of anything but the backbreaking routine of farm life. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a modest farm in Greenfield Township, a scatter of fields and woodlots west of Detroit. His father, William Ford, was an Irish immigrant who came to America in search of better soil and sturdier dreams. His mother, Mary Lydigut Ford, was born in Michigan, the daughter of Belgian settlers. Together, they carved out a simple life, rooted in the rhythms of plowing, planting, harvesting, and repeating it all again, season after season. Young Henry was expected to follow suit. But if the plow was his father's pride, it was Henry's prison. He hated the drudgery of farm work, the early dawns, the sweat, the endless cycle of chores that left little room for curiosity. While his father saw the farm as honest work, Henry saw it as a trap that chained him to the same patch of earth forever. But even on that farm, the seeds of the machine age were sprouting. The Civil War had ended just 2 years before Henry's birth, and America was surging into an industrial boom. Railroads crisscrossed the nation. Steam engines roared through towns. Factories belched smoke into skies, once owned by hawks and thunderclouds. At age 12, Henry discovered something that would change him forever: a pocket watch. He didn't just use it, he took it apart, piece by tiny piece, and then put it back together. Word spread. Soon the neighborhood boys were bringing him their busted timepieces, and the boy with the restless hands became the local watch fixer. Where other boys might have seen a pocket watch as a keepsake, Henry saw it as a puzzle, a system, an engine waiting to be understood, and maybe improved. His mother, Mary, understood his curiosity. She gave him space to tinker, to wander, to peer into the guts of clocks and toys. But life has a way of snapping dreams back to the earth. When Mary died in 1876, 13-year-old Henry was devastated. He was forced back into the cycle of chores that bored him to tears. His father hoped the loss would bind Henry tighter to the land, that he'd grow up to inherit the farm, steady and rooted like the oak trees out back. Henry had other plans. By the age of 16, he'd had enough of plows and pastures. One morning in 1879, he packed a small satchel and walked away from Greenfield Township, heading for the pulsing heart of Detroit. The city wasn't exactly a metropolis yet. It was still dusty streets, horse-drawn carts, and gas lamps. But for Henry Ford, it was a universe of possibility, humming with steam engines, coal furnaces, and gears. He found work as an apprentice machinist at James F. Flour and Bras, then at the Detroit Dry Dock Company. He swept floors, cleaned tools, and watched, wide-eyed, as older men shaped iron and brass into engines that could do more work than a dozen farmhands ever could. In those early years, Henry was just another face in the factory crowd, a wiry farm boy with oil-slicked hands and a stare that seemed to drill right through the steel he polished. He learned fast. He absorbed everything: how pistons pumped, how flywheels spun, how steam could be harnessed to power ships and machines. And every night when the shop doors closed, Henry stayed late. He experimented. He built. He dreamed. But back on the farm, the land still tugged at him, not with love, but with necessity. In 1882, he returned to Greenfield Township to run the family farm's steam-powered portable sawmill. To his father, this looked like surrender, a return to the plow. But Henry had no intention of giving in to the soil. The sawmill's engine fascinated him more than the timber it cut. He tinkered with every nut and bolt, testing ways to make the clunky machine run smoother, faster, better. Soon, he started taking side jobs as a repairman for steam engines in nearby towns. His reputation grew. The boy who hated the plow could coax life out of any machine. He spent nights reading about engines, steam turbines, and the emerging whispers of an even greater promise, the gasoline-powered internal combustion engine. In 1888, Ford married Clara Bryant, the farmer's daughter who would stand by him through failures, debts, and the relentless drumbeat of a dream that seemed impossible at the time, a horseless carriage that the common man could own. Clara didn't care much for engines, but she believed in Henry. That belief would become the secret fuel he'd burn through again and again when the banks said no, when the investors laughed, when the factories caught fire, and when the experts scoffed that no sane family would trust a gasoline buggy. Years later, Henry Ford would stand in gleaming showrooms and massive factories that pulsed like iron hearts, spitting out cars for millions. But inside him, there was always the farm boy who hated the plow, the kid who saw the land not as promise, but as prison. That farm boy would teach America how to trade muscle for machines, how to swap calloused hands for levers and gears, how to take the timeless drudgery of the plow and replace it with the whir of an engine under a metal hood. He didn't just build cars. He built an escape hatch for every farm kid who ever stared across an empty field and dreamed of motion. The first machine, the first dream. Long before the gleaming rows of Model Ts, long before the River Rouge plant swallowed up square miles of Michigan marshland and belched out cars by the thousands, Henry Ford's dream began in a shed no bigger than a modern garage, and in a mind that couldn't stop seeing the future under layers of oil and brass. By the late 1880s, the young farm boy turned apprentice machinist had built a reputation in rural Michigan as a gifted engine doctor. Farmers brought him sputtering, portable steam engines, broken threshers, clanking sawmill boilers, and Henry fixed them all, often leaving them running better than when they left the factory floor. But for Ford, fixing other men's machines was never enough. He wanted to make his own, something new, something alive. At the time, the steam engine still ruled American industry. It pulled trains, powered mills, and turned the wheels of factories and ships. But steam had its limits. It was massive, clumsy, always thirsty for fuel and water. Its boilers exploded like bombs if mishandled, and worse, it chained the engine to tracks or belts or enormous iron wheels. For someone like Ford, who dreamed of freedom from the farm and the factory alike, steam was the past. The future was gasoline. The spark for his first dream arrived in fragments. Articles in engineering journals, whispered news from Europe that German tinkerers, men like Carl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler, had managed to harness a volatile vapor called gasoline inside a small, closed cylinder. Instead of coal-fired steam, they used tiny explosions to drive pistons. Instead of a locomotive the size of a house, these engines could be small enough to fit under a carriage seat. No tracks, no horses, no stables, just fuel, spark, motion. The idea caught fire in Henry's head. In his evenings, after tending the sawmill or repairing a neighbor's steam tractor, he'd retreat to a ramshackle workshop behind his farmhouse, part woodshed, part laboratory. He covered his workbench with bits of iron, crude pistons, bicycle chains, pipe fittings, and brass carburetor parts. His tools were simple: a hammer, a file, a hand drill, and a lathe driven by foot power, but his mind spun faster than any machine in that dark, oil-scented shed. His first real prototype was not a car at all, but a simple gasoline engine. Ford labored over the fuel system, the ignition, the tiny flywheel. He read every scrap of news about the Otto cycle, the four-stroke process that turned a spark and fuel vapor into steady, contained power. The first time he managed to get his crude engine to cough, sputter, and roar to life, neighbors reported hearing an unholy racket echoing through the Michigan night. Some thought it was an explosion. Ford thought it was proof. He mounted the tiny motor onto a workbench, connected it to a simple drive mechanism, and watched it spin. It was primitive, loud, and unreliable, but it ran without steam, without horses. The farm boy who hated the plow had found his lever to pry the world off its rails. Of course, The next step was the hardest, building something that could actually carry him down a road. His second great invention, the real first machine, was the quadricycle. By the early 1890s, bicycles were the rage across America's cities. Lightweight, nimble, cheap. Ford looked at the bicycle and saw potential. What if you could combine the freedom of two wheels with the raw power of his gasoline engine? He salvaged old bicycle tires, adapted bicycle spokes, and hammered together a simple, boxy frame. He scrounged scrap metal for the chassis and improvised rudimentary steering using chains and levers. The tiny two-cylinder engine he designed produced only about 4 horsepower, but for Ford, it might as well have been lightning trapped under a metal seat. The quadricycle's first test run has passed into automotive folklore. On a rainy night in June 1896, Ford and a handful of friends pushed the contraption out of the shed. The problem was, the quadricycle was too wide to fit through the workshop door, so Ford, undeterred, took an axe and widened the doorway by hacking away parts of the wall. He wasn't about to let a wall stop his dream from rolling onto Michigan Avenue. That night, the quadricycle rattled and spat fire down the dark streets of Detroit. People gawked from porches as a man with a bowler hat and oil-smudged sleeves bounced through the mud, perched atop what looked like a motorized buggy. It wheezed, backfired, and threatened to die with every pothole, but it moved under its own power. No horses, no tracks, just gears, gas, and a stubborn farm boy's will. The quadricycle's top speed was about 20 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun any horse in the neighborhood. Its controls were primitive, the steering wobbly, the brakes laughable, but it was a beginning. With every mile, Ford's idea gained traction, that the future wouldn't ride on rails, it would ride on roads that stretched wherever people wanted to go. After that first ride, Henry knew the rest of his life would revolve around making this idea better, cheaper, more reliable. Not a toy for rich men, but a tool for ordinary farmers, clerks, factory workers. A machine that would free them from the drudgery of the horse, the tedium of the plow, the slow crawl of wagon wheels on muddy ruts. The quadricycle did not change the world overnight, but it changed Henry Ford. It convinced him that what he had was not just a machine, but a mission. He would build cars for the people, and to do that, he would reinvent how things were built altogether. From the plow to the quadricycle, from the shed to the open road, Ford's first machine carried more than a tinkerer's dream. It carried the seed of a revolution that would roar down dirt roads, pave them with asphalt, connect farms to towns, towns to cities, and families to futures they could once only imagine. The road to the Model T. When Henry Ford coaxed his sputtering quadricycle down the muddy streets of Detroit that June night in 1896, he wasn't just testing a machine. He was testing a question that would haunt him for years. Could you take this fragile, smoking contraption and make it so sturdy, so simple, and so cheap that an ordinary man could buy it, fix it, and drive it anywhere? In that question lay the seed of the car that would change the world, the Model T. But between the rattling quadricycle and the first gleaming black Model T was a decade-long road littered with failures, betrayals, bankruptcies, and the sheer stubborn genius of a man who would not quit. The first false starts. After the success of his quadricycle, Ford knew he needed money, serious money, to build real cars in real numbers. In 1899, he found his first backers, Detroit lumber baron William H. Murphy among them, and founded the Detroit Automobile Company. For a moment, the future looked bright, a new factory, eager investors, and a chance to show the world what a horseless carriage could be. But Ford's perfectionism, the same trait that made him a brilliant tinkerer, nearly ruined him. He hated compromise. He kept redesigning engines, tinkering with gearboxes, testing new frames. Meanwhile, the factory sat idle and the money bled away. Worse yet, the cars that did come out of the Detroit Automobile Company were fragile, clumsy, and wildly expensive, more luxury curiosities for the wealthy than practical machines for the farmer or clerk. By 1901, the company collapsed under its own weight. Murphy, furious but still intrigued by Ford's raw talent, gave him one more shot. Ford regrouped and did what he always did when cornered. He built something that moved. He constructed a lean, lightweight racer, the Sweepstakes, and on a cold October day in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, he drove it himself, beating the reigning American champion Alexander Winton in front of a roaring crowd. The victory didn't make him rich, but it made him famous. Racing became Ford's unlikely proving ground. He built faster and faster machines, the Arrow, the 999, the Ford Special. Each thundered down dirt tracks at terrifying speeds, driven by daredevils like Barney Oldfield and Ford's own friend Tom Cooper. Newspapers loved it. Here was the farm boy who hated the plow, now the king of speed, showing Americans that the car wasn't just an expensive toy. It could be thrilling, powerful, American. The Ford Motor Company flush with new fame, Ford convinced Murphy and new investors to give him another chance, this time on his own terms. In June 1903, the Ford Motor Company was born, but it nearly died in its cradle. The company's entire future hinged on the success of a single car, the Model A, a simple two-seater runabout with a two-cylinder engine that cost about $850. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than most. When the first 3 orders came in, Ford and his team used the cash deposits to buy the parts to finish the cars. If those first customers had backed out, the dream might have ended right there. But they didn't back out. The cars ran and ran well. Word spread, orders trickled in, then poured. The Model A was followed by the Model B, the Model C, each a little better, a little cheaper. Ford learned from every design, lighter engines, simpler parts, cheaper materials. But he was still nagged by a truth. His cars were good, but not yet truly for everyone. He wanted a car that wouldn't just live in city garages, but in barns and sheds, that could haul a family down muddy country lanes and across rutted roads that hadn't yet heard the word paved. The vision takes shape. By 1906, Ford was ready to bet the farm and the company on one bold idea, a single perfect model. No more dabbling with half a dozen different cars. No more fancy trim or luxury tweaks for wealthy buyers. Just one rugged, dependable machine that could take a beating, be repaired in a barn with simple tools, and cost less than a good team of horses. He found allies in unlikely places. People like Charles Sorensen, a Danish immigrant pattern maker with an engineer's mind, and Harold Wills, a draftsman with a gift for turning Ford's scribbled sketches into workable blueprints. Together, they labored over prototypes in the Piquette Avenue plant in Detroit, an old brick building where cold drafts blew through the walls and the floorboards trembled with the racket of hammers and lathes. They tested steel alloys. They obsessed over the weight of axles and the shape of pistons. Ford's core philosophy was simple. Any part that doesn't serve a purpose is waste. Make it lighter, make it stronger, make it cheaper. He scrapped entire designs overnight if he thought they could shave $1 or a pound off the final cost. 1908, the Tin Lizzie is born. On October 1st, 1908, the world got its first glimpse of Ford's dream made real, the Model T. It was ugly by the standards of luxury cars, a squat, no-nonsense four-cylinder machine with a simple body, high clearance to tackle dirt roads, and an engine that could be fixed by a farmer with pliers and a wrench. It cost about $850, already cheaper than many rivals. And Ford swore he'd get the price down year after year. What made the Model T revolutionary wasn't just its affordability, it was its indestructibility. You could run it through a muddy pasture, drive it down a rutted farm lane, or park it in a shed all winter. In a pinch, you could even run it on kerosene or homemade fuel. People called it the Tin Lizzie, the sturdy, reliable, slightly battered friend who never let you down. Within a year, Ford couldn't build them fast enough. Orders poured in from every corner of America. Farmers, doctors, traveling salesmen, small-town families tired of horses and wagons. But the real genius lay ahead. To keep up with demand and to drive the price even lower, Ford had to reinvent how things were made. He turned his mind not just to engines and wheels, but to the factory floor itself, the assembly line revolution. In 1913, at his Highland Park plant, Ford and his team unveiled the moving assembly line, an idea borrowed from meatpacking plants and perfected with ruthless logic. Instead of skilled craftsmen building a whole car by hand, each worker now repeated one simple task as the car moved past them on a belt. The result, cars rolled out faster than ever, from 12 hours of labor per car to just 93 minutes. With each improvement, the cost dropped. By 1916, the Model T sold for about $360, within reach of millions of working families. Ford doubled down, famously paying his workers $5 a day, unheard of at the time, so they could afford to buy the very cars they built. The dream realized by the 1920s, the Model T wasn't just a car, it was a cultural earthquake on four wheels. It freed farmers from isolation. It let rural kids go to school miles away. It put Sunday picnics, family vacations, and cross country road trips within reach of people who'd never seen more than a day's ride from their farm. By the time production ended in 1927, Ford had sold over 15 million Model Ts, more than any other car in history at that point. It transformed America's landscape. Gas stations, paved highways, motels, drive-ins, all sprang up in the wake of the Tin Lizzie's rattling wheels. But beneath the roar of the assembly line and the glow of the showroom, that same question from the night of the quadricycle still lingered. Could you make a machine so simple, so sturdy that it freed ordinary people from the limits of the old world? In the Model T, Henry Ford found his answer, and in that answer, America found its open road. When we picture Henry Ford's factories today, we see them bathed in the glow of progress. Endless lines of gleaming Model Ts rolling off the line, workers pocketing that famous $5 a day wage, America on wheels and roaring into the modern age. But look closer. Beneath the hum of the assembly line lay shadows that tell a very different story. Ford's Highland Park and River Rouge plants were temples of efficiency. But for the men on the line, they could feel like iron cages. The moving assembly line, perfected by Ford in 1913, cut the time to build a car from 12 hours to about 90 minutes. It was an engineering marvel and a human grindstone. On the old factory floor, a skilled mechanic might spend hours crafting one car from start to finish. He might take pride in fitting the gears, shaping the fenders, testing the engine by ear. But Ford's line didn't want craftsmen, it wanted cogs. Each man performed one narrow, repetitive task. Bolt this, hammer that, move aside. Again, 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 hundreds of times a day. For many workers, the monotony was soul-crushing. Some collapsed from exhaustion, like their arms and backs locked in the same motion for hours. Others simply walked off the line, never to return. Ford's astonishing production gains masked an ugly truth. His factories chewed through men like raw material. In the early years, labor turnover rates at Ford plants soared to nearly 400%, a revolving door of workers who couldn't take the pace or the dehumanizing grind. To plug the holes, Ford unveiled his radical solution, the $5 workday. It doubled the standard wage overnight. Newspapers screamed. Critics called him a lunatic. But Ford wasn't giving away money out of kindness. He was buying stability. With $5 a day, he could attract and keep workers willing to endure the mind-numbing routine of the line. For many laborers, the trade-off was worth it. A Ford job could lift an immigrant family into the middle class, but it cost them pride, independence, and often their health. Then came the other layer of control, the sociological department. To Henry Ford, efficiency didn't stop at the factory gate. He wanted efficient workers in the factory and respectable workers at home. Ford's army of inspectors made surprise visits to workers' houses. They checked for drunkenness, slovenliness, gambling, even how the children were raised. A man who drank too much or whose wife didn't keep a spotless kitchen could find himself demoted or fired. Ford called it moral uplift. His workers called it intrusion, but most stayed silent. The $5 wage kept them loyal and fearful in equal measure. The shop floor had other shadows too, the enforcers. Ford's right-hand man, Harry Bennett, ran the notorious Ford Service Department, a private security force that operated more like a paramilitary gang than a workplace monitor. Officially, they kept order, cracked down on theft, and protected company property. In reality, they spied on workers, broke up union meetings, and weren't afraid to use fists, clubs, or worse. When the Great Depression hit, the darkness spread even further. Workers demanded better conditions, the right to organize. But Ford despised unions. He saw them as parasites that threatened his iron grip on costs and productivity. So when union organizers came to River Rouge in the 1930s, they found themselves stalked by Bennett's men, beaten on sidewalks, or blacklisted from other jobs. The most infamous clash came in 1937 at the Battle of the Overpass. The United Auto Workers tried to pass out leaflets to Ford employees at the River Rouge plant. Bennett's service department thugs descended on them, fists and batons swinging. Photographers captured the beating. The nation saw bruised and bloodied men sprawled on the concrete, and Henry Ford's carefully polished image cracked. And then, behind it all, there was Ford himself, a man who preached thrift and honesty, yet published vile anti-Semitic tracts in his company newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Week after week in the 1920s, Ford's paper spewed conspiracy theories blaming Jews for everything from banking conspiracies to moral decay. He reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fraudulent text that fueled anti-Semitic hatred worldwide. Even after lawsuits and outrage forced him to apologize, the damage was done. Henry Ford had become an icon not only of mass production, but of bigotry that would echo far, far beyond his lifetime. So when you picture that gleaming assembly line, the heartbeat of America's car age, remember the other side of it. The exhaustion, the surveillance, the cracked skulls on the picket line. Remember that progress often arrives hand in hand with human cost. For millions of Americans, the Model T unlocked freedom. But for thousands who built it, the factory floor sometimes felt like another kind of prison, one lit by the promise of modernity, but haunted by the shadows of power and fear. By the time Henry Ford died in 1947, he was both a titan and a ghost, a man whose name had become a byword for American ingenuity, but whose darker impulses left cracks in the pedestal he built for himself. On the surface, his legacy seemed unshakable. His factories had churned out over 15 million Model Ts, reshaping towns, cities, and the very rhythm of daily life. The assembly line he perfected didn't just birth cars, it birthed the modern age of mass production. Radios, refrigerators, washing machines all owed something to Ford's relentless drive to make complicated things cheap, fast, and for everyone. Even industries he never touched imitated his obsession with efficiency. When you see a supermarket stocked with identical boxes or a package arriving on your doorstep because an automated system sorted it at lightning speed, that's Ford's ghost, humming on the conveyor belt. Yet beneath that bright myth lies the long, stubborn shadow he cast, a shadow that makes Henry Ford so endlessly complicated. For one, his very revolution was a double-edged sword. The assembly line freed millions from the farm, but it chained them to repetitive, grueling labor. The same innovation that made cars cheap made work mind-numbing. Ford had promised that machines would liberate men from drudgery. Instead, they made men into extensions of the machines. Some historians argue that the modern burnout crisis, the feeling of being a replaceable cog in an enormous machine, starts right there on Ford's factory floor. And then there was Ford's war with his own workers. As the 20th century rolled on, labor unions grew more vocal, more determined. Ford remained frozen in another time, convinced that benevolent dictatorship, his dictatorship, was better than negotiation. While other automakers grudgingly made peace with unions, Ford doubled down on intimidation, surveillance, and brute force. It wasn't until the brutal strikes and beatings of the late 1930s and the rise of the United Auto Workers that Ford's empire finally cracked open. When the company was forced to sign its first union contract in 1941, it was a stunning surrender for the man who had vowed it would never happen. Yet perhaps the darkest stain on Ford's legacy was not how he built cars, but the ideas he spread when he wasn't building them. In the 1920s, when his Dearborn Independent newspaper unleashed a flood of anti-Semitic propaganda, Ford's reach went far beyond America. His writings were translated and distributed in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler himself admired Ford, so much that he kept a portrait of the American carmaker above his desk and cited Ford's international Jew conspiracies as inspiration. In 1938, Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. Though Ford eventually shut down the paper and issued a half-hearted apology, the damage had been done. His bigotry had been broadcast to millions, reinforcing hate at a time when the world teetered on the brink of genocide. In the end, even Ford's own family and company had to rescue his reputation from himself. In his final years, as age and illness clouded his mind, his once razor-sharp genius hardened into paranoia. He trusted almost no one, clashed with his only son, Edsel Ford, the man who quietly modernized the company behind the scenes. Some said Edsel died young, partly from the strain of living under his father's suffocating shadow. When Edsel passed in 1943, A heartbroken but rigid Ford briefly took back control of his empire, but he was a relic in a world at war, struggling to keep pace with the industrial giants his own ideas had helped create. The same plants that once produced millions of Model Ts were now building B-24 bombers and tanks, crucial for defeating the fascism Ford's poisonous ideas had once fueled abroad. It was an irony he never seemed to grasp. When Ford died in his sleep in 1947, millions mourned. Factories fell silent for a moment of respect. Newspapers called him an American genius, a hero of the working man, the man who put the world on wheels. All true, but not the whole truth. Today, the company still bears his name. The Ford Blue Oval still shines on cars around the globe, and the idea that ordinary people deserve to own the future, not just the wealthy, still rings true in every affordable gadget and machine we take for granted. But so does the other truth, that innovation can cost people their humanity, that progress can hide exploitation, that visionaries can build bright new worlds with shadows at their heart. So next time you see a Ford parked at the curb or an assembly line churning out goods at breakneck speed, remember the man behind it all, not just the icon, but the contradiction. A farm boy who hated the plow and loved the machine, a dreamer who put the world on wheels, but sometimes ran over the very people who helped him do it. In the end, Henry Ford left us with a question every generation must answer. How do you take genius and ambition and keep them from swallowing the very people they claim to set free? So who was Henry Ford? Genius or tyrant? Liberator or controller? He gave America cheap cars, but made men work like machines. He built the middle class, but fought the unions that protected it. He shaped the 20th century, but left stains history can't polish away. Next time you grip a steering wheel, remember the man who made it possible, and ask yourself what price progress really costs. I'm the Duke of New York. Thanks for riding shotgun with me tonight on Faces of History. If you like this story, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves to drive. Stay curious, stay awake, and never forget, sometimes the future runs on oil, sweat, and contradictions. Good night.